So I wanted to cover a few things having to do with my bike today. The first one is I have a battery mount on the bottom of the down tube of the frame, and it has these pop rivets that were holding the battery mount to the frame, and they just had gotten loose over time and started to rattle. And so I contacted the manufacturer and they said drill them out and replace them with Rivnuts. So let's talk a little bit about Rivnuts. So Rivnuts start off as a kind of a cylinder with a flange on it like this. But you notice that part at the top towards the flange is different, and that's because that's going to deform as you tighten a screw or as you pull up on it. So in this image you see the one on the left is the original form, and then as that screw gets tightened or gets pulled up, it deforms the body of the Rivnut and it clamps it onto the frame or whatever you're clamping it to. And of course there are dedicated tools that allow you to install a Rivnut, but I thought I should be able to do it mostly with stuff that I have around the shop. So here's the Rivnut that I was using and an M4 screw. And then the other pieces that I'm going to use are just a washer, kind of a fender washer, and then something that's called a thrust bearing. And I confess I didn't have any thrust bearings around the shop, but they can be had for, I think I got 10 of them for less than $2 on eBay. So you really just can't beat it. And I think it works well for this application. This piece that I'm threading on now is sometimes called a mending plate. It's just a steel bar with holes in it. And you'll see what I do with that here in a minute. And then the last thing I thread on here is just a lock washer. Okay, then the last thing I do is just thread on the Rivnut, and then the Rivnut will slide into the material. In this case, I'm just using a piece of plumber's tape. Now, normally you would drill a very specifically sized hole for the Rivnut so that it just fits in. It's kind of a snug fit into the material, but I thought this would be a good test. So here I've got the plumber's tape clamped into a vise, and my left hand is holding that mending plate, and now I'm going to start to tighten the screw. So of course the theory here is that the screw head and the fender washer will try and rotate. The thrust bearing sort of takes that rotation and doesn't pass it on to the mending plate underneath. And of course underneath the mending plate is that lock washer, which is kind of grabbing onto the top of the Rivnut. Of course what you're trying to prevent is the Rivnut spinning with the screw. One thing I didn't do here, or when I did this with my bike, was count the number of rotations of the screw to estimate how far the screw would need to pull up in order to adequately deform the Rivnut. And I think that would just be a good way to adjust so you're not just guessing. And obviously when you're doing this on a bike, you can't see the other side the way you can here. So that's why it would be important to have a method for determining when to stop spinning the screw. So having determined that the Rivnut had bottomed out, now I'm starting to reverse the direction of the screw, so I'm going to pull the screw out. Okay, you can see that the lock washer sort of did bite into the face of the Rivnut and mar it a little bit, so if that's important you might want to find another method. And you can see that the Rivnut is deformed and it's holding to the back of the material there, so this worked out pretty well for here, and it worked out great on my bike. Okay, on to another subject. When it comes time to remove the cranks on your bike, for whatever reason, you usually use a crank puller like this one. And I've had one for a long time and it's worked well, but it came from the days of the square taper bottom brackets. But on this bike, I didn't have a square taper, I had what's called an Octalink. And one of the clear differences between the two is that the Octalink has a much larger hole through the center of the axle. Unfortunately, this meant that my existing crank puller didn't work very well, so let me walk through it here. Here I'm removing the bolt that holds the crank snug up to the bottom bracket. And now here's the crank puller, and of course here's the plunger that would normally push against the bottom bracket, but unfortunately the plunger on this is too small. It can slide right through that hole in the center of the Octalink. So here I am tightening down the plunger, and then of course you see it bottom out and it's done nothing. And of course the reason for that is that the plunger was again going through that hole in the center of the Octalink bottom bracket, and so it wasn't able to push against it and therefore allow the crank to get pulled out. So what's the solution for this? So for me the solution was a 5/16 inch bolt. It just fairly neatly fit through the splines on the crank, but would rest on the shoulder of the bottom bracket. And so it provided a nice surface to allow the crank puller to push against to pull the crank away. And here you can see how the bolt head neatly fits through the splines on the crank arm. Okay, one more tip today. This is a bottom bracket tool, and I've used it to good effect for a long time. But for me anyway, it can be difficult sometimes to keep it engaged in the bottom bracket while I'm trying to wrench it around. And you can see mine here, the tips here of those splines are kind of in bad shape. And it's probably my fault, but anyway, it's just something I have to deal with. So one of the ways that I do is by putting a bolt through it. And of course putting a washer and a nut on the other end to hold it securely in place. And a couple things to note about this. Always remember when you're doing bottom bracket removal is that the right side, the drive side, is a left-hand thread. It's a reverse thread. The other thing I'll point out here is you'll notice that every once in a while I go over and just give the nut a spin, and that's just to give it a little bit of slack, because as you're pulling that side of the bottom bracket out, you need just a little bit more room on the bolt on that side. Okay, well that was the Rivnuts and the crank arm puller and the bottom bracket tool, and so I hope these were useful and that you keep your bike running.